guys, this is Andrew with High Level Reviews, and today I'd like to take a look at Secret of Mana. Originally released as Seiken Densetsu 2 in Japan, Secret of Mana is the sequel to the 1991 game Seiken Densetsu, which was released in North America as Final Fantasy Adventure and in Europe as Mystic Quest. The game was developed and published by Square and released in North America in October of 1993 on the Super Nintendo. The team responsible for Secret of Mana was the same team that produced Final Fantasy III. In fact, this project started out as Final Fantasy IV before it grew into something quite different and splintered in different directions. There was even a brief period that it was called Chrono Trigger, hilariously enough. It was Square's first leap into the action RPG realm, and they wasted little time creating one of the best in the genre. From its innovative recharge meter between attacks that kept it from feeling like a Zelda clone or a monotonous hack-and-slash title, to the introduction of its ring menu system, which Square would go on to use in several more titles, and its inclusion of cooperative multiplayer that allowed a second or third player to drop in and out of combat. Square did a lot to push the action RPG forward and added traditional RPG elements that weren't often included in this experience, such as a more robust leveling system. To think that this game was very close to being cancelled is even more shocking when you consider the aforementioned facts. It was originally intended to be a launch title for the SNES CD add-on. When Sony and Nintendo went separate ways and Sony converted the work on the SNES CD to the PlayStation, Square decided to adapt the game to the SNES cartridge. There were major concessions that had to be made, and the developers initially tried to back out of the project but were stopped by upper management in Square. The original game was much darker and somber in tone with multiple routes and endings. The director of Secret of Mana, Koichi Ishii, estimated that nearly 40% of the game had to be trimmed off, with obvious manifestations of this being stairs that led to nowhere, inaccessible doors, and some very buggy parts, especially when a lot of simultaneous animations are occurring. And many have since claimed that the primary reason for Square moving from Nintendo to Sony in 1996 and taking Final Fantasy with it was this rocky development period they faced when trying to complete Secret of Mana. While it's simultaneously fun and disappointing to think about what might have been, the game we received was nevertheless an instant classic. The game starts with the main character Randy, though you can name the characters anything you want, goofing around with a few friends. They are searching for a treasure that is rumored to be hidden in the forest near their village called Potos. Inevitably, one of the boys falls into a lake and discovers an old sword embedded in a stone. An incorporeal voice urges him to remove the stone, and once Randy does, it unleashes fiends all over the countryside near the village. The villagers and elder of Potos fears this is a horrible omen and can't risk putting the town in danger. It appears as though the Mana Sword serves as a beacon to the monsters. Randy is banished from Potos by the elder that adopted and raised him. It's a harsh scene despite a lack of build-up or emotional connection, and quickly gets the player right into the game and, more importantly, the action and excellent gameplay. A wandering knight named Gemma recognized the Mana Sword in Randy's possession and urged him to revitalize it by visiting the 8 Mana temples. The rest of the game is spent visiting these temples in beautifully designed and distinct lands with Prim, a self-empowered and headstrong girl trying to locate her love interest Diluc, and Popoi, an impish sprite that is ultimately a very kind-hearted being, despite initially trying to swindle Randy out of a large chunk of money during their first encounter in the dwarf village. Though many aspects of this tale are derivative and cliche, and it never quite hits the devastating notes that other contemporary titles, like Terranigma, manage to construct, it still keeps the player engrossed and, I'll reiterate, moving forward. In a game that is so focused on action and gameplay and the ravishing environments the player visits, it's a treat to not get bogged down by lengthy expositions and still experience a great story with huge late game revelations and twists. The writers also did an excellent job of developing characters. All 3 of the characters show growth, and all 3 suffer through major heartaches and trials, only to grow stronger and more dedicated to the team's ultimate goal. And when you really consider it, it's kind of a miracle Square was even able to piece together a coherent story and plot, despite some small holes here and there, with all of the content that was erased, again at an estimated 40%. And the infamously difficult time Ted Woolsey had translating this game to English. He worked by himself and was given 30 days, yes, just 30 days to complete this massive project, at a time when translating games could take many months, and sometimes led to year-long delays on American releases. He even had to make major changes to it in order to fit the entire story on the game. To make matters even worse, there was very little sequential text. Imagine receiving a novel in unordered paragraph chunks at a time and having to make sense of it. In an interview, Woolsey stated some games, like Secret of Mana, were being written and rewritten at night, and I'd come in the next day and have to redo any number of text files. This sounds like a nightmare. Despite an egregiously abbreviated English translation, the game was released on time for the holiday season and, as mentioned before, sold very well. With so many things seemingly conspiring against it, Secret of Mana still told a wonderful story. Secret of Mana is played from a top-down perspective, and enemies are fought on the same screen in real time. The player is free to take a swing at a foe, but is then immediately sapped of all energy. In this tapped state, swings do very little damage until the energy bar reaches 100% again. This, as I stated in the Secret of Evermore review, is a great balancing mechanism that forces the player to make calculated attacks and punishes brain-dead button mashing. All three of the characters are playable and each sport a distinct and strategically diverse style. The main character, Randy, is the most proficient physical attacker of the group and can't use magic. Prim uses supportive magic with just a few offensive spells mixed in, and Popoy uses the most powerful offensive spells but is physically very weak and struggles when focused. The beauty of this design is the ability to choose according to your preferences, and if the main character isn't that, it really doesn't matter. These clearly defined roles become even more important if you have friends, and some of you might, who knows, willing to play with you. Yes, Secret Mana has multiplayer, up to 3 that can easily drop in and out. At the time it was released, a player needed a multi-tap to take full advantage of this feature. This was huge and revolutionary at the time. Not that multiplayer didn't exist prior to this, it obviously did, but the RPG was conventionally a solo experience. This really changed the game, and in many ways foreshadowed future RPG titles that utilized multiplayer in various forms. There are 8 different weapons that your party can wield. Repeated use of specific weapons can level them up and unlock a special charged attack. This can be done 8 times, with each charged attack getting longer and more elaborate. You locate orbs while adventuring and take them to the blacksmith Watts to improve the corresponding weapon's stats. While there are some occasional hit detection issues and some wonky graphical glitches when multiple animations are going off on screen, it's otherwise a very smooth and easy to use, easy to master fighting system. My primary complaint is that charging a weapon to level 8 rarely feels worth it and isn't often pragmatic given the way enemies are usually able to hit you during the process and cancel a potentially huge attack. During the course of the charge, the player could have spammed magic or normal attacks and killed the monster or pack of monsters 3 times over. It just felt ridiculously underwhelming for the time investment. It was a good idea but poorly executed. As the party rescues elementals, you gain the use of a type of magic associated with that elemental. There are 8 in total. Similarly to weapons, magic also has levels that you increase by using the spells. As they level up, they gain more potency and have slight visual changes, which was a nice touch. Though, to keep the party from getting too mighty by power leveling magic early on, the levels are gated by mana seeds. As you unlock mana seeds with the mana sword, the maximum level of your magic increases. Though some critics have bemoaned the tying of certain spells to particular characters, I found that it really drove home the identities of them and kept the player actively switching between them as the situation called for a specific character's expertise, be it healing and support from Prim or devastating offensive spells from Popoy. And while Randy can't use magic, his sword being the ultimate weapon both literally and figuratively, he doesn't need it with 2 strong casters right behind him. It is a finely balanced system. My only concern with magic is that it eventually makes the game, and more specifically the wonderful bosses, a bit laughable. So long as you have a high level spell, and sometimes this doesn't necessarily even need to be an element the boss is weak to, you only need to spam it. While I love cruising through bosses, I couldn't help but feel a little cheap. Still, it is a blast to hack and burst your way through this world's inhabitants, and there aren't many action RPGs that even come close to this level of fun. Secret of Mana pushed the Super Nintendo to its graphical limits. It was one of the few games to utilize the 512 by 224 pixel high-resolution mode to display additional information at times. It is a beautiful game, probably one of the best looking and most crisp Super Nintendo titles. The sprites are wonderful, there are plenty of character-specific animations, the locations are all diverse and excellently designed, and despite some palette swapping, and in some situations palette swapping of bosses, which is just lazy, though I guess in this case I'd bet on it being another issue of limited time and resources due to cuts, the enemies were still pretty varied and all fun to fight, which is not entirely surprising since Koichi Ishii designed many of the iconic monsters in the Final Fantasy universe, such as Chocobos and Moogles. It was visually impressive during the 16-bit era and continues to wow newcomers and players returning to the world. The music in Secret of Mana was composed by Hiroki Kikuta. He spent nearly 24 hours a day in his office, switching between composing and editing to create a soundtrack that, according to him, would be more immersive and three-dimensional. Kikuta didn't have sound engineers making samples of instruments for him like most contemporary composers did. He instead created his own samples that would align with the hardware capabilities of the Super Nintendo. This enabled him to know precisely how it would sound as a finished product, rather than trying to anticipate the dip in sound quality that usually occurred when tracks were played on the Super Nintendo. One of the other impressive aspects of Kikuta's work was the synchronizing of events in the game with his music. Kikuta explained in a 2009 interview, "First of all, planning synchronicity between sounds and images was not so common in games back then. My background was in animation, so I knew the kinds of results you could get from designing an interplay between the sound and screen. But it was so hard to explain it to people in the game field. There really were few precedents for it at the beginning. That was what motivated me to give it a try." He wound up using a stopwatch to time his music to the sprite-based animation by hand, which clearly evinces the dedication this man had to his craft, and the result was breathtaking. The soundtrack precisely oscillates from dark and brooding to lighthearted and ebullient, and moments are that much more poignant because of it. The broad influences in his eclectic taste are also immediately noticeable, as tracks range from electronic and synth to tracks that pay homage to French composer Claude Debussy and his impressionist music. Kikuta has since stated that his soundtrack was his favorite creation, and it's readily apparent why. This is a superb soundtrack, and the lofty way that most people speak of it isn't hyperbole, it's that good. While Secret of Mana is an easy game to praise, it certainly has its fair share of shortcomings, from graphical hiccups to palette swapping and an abusable magic system. But the thing is, all of the qualities that are often so difficult to objectively speak about, such as the enigmatic concept of charm and fun, Secret of Mana is overburdened with. To have so much content expelled and still produce a game teeming with character and beautiful moments and innovative combat systems that help set the table for many future projects just proves to me the passion the people that worked on this title had for their work. It's an important part of gaming history and a rewarding experience to boot. Those two things don't often go hand in hand. If you enjoyed the review, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. My Twitter is also located right below the video. This has been Andrew with High Low Reviews, and I appreciate you guys stopping by.